Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. I have an exciting announcement this week. I've just signed a contract with Baker Academic to write a new resource for people who are interested in studying the Bible. It is going to be potentially called Engaging the Psalms, and it's a workbook that works through the entire book of Psalms. So on this special Torah Tuesday, I want to dive with you into Psalm 1 because it talks about the Torah. So we can do that on Torah Tuesday. So the big question that this psalm provokes in us is, how can we stay rooted when life seems out of control? And if any time life seemed out of control, being in the midst of a pandemic is one of those times. And if your life has been disrupted this year and you're wondering, how can I stay rooted or how can I stay grounded when things around me are constantly shifting, the rules are constantly changing, and I have to rethink everything, then Psalm 1 is a really great place for you to look. So Psalm 1 offers us a portrait of a life that is rooted and fruitful. It begins, I'm reading from my own translation here, it begins by saying, "Oh, the joys of the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand around on sinners' pathway, or sit with scoffers." Most English translations begin this psalm with the word blessed or blessed, and I've chosen to follow the New Living Translation in saying instead, "Oh, the joys," because the word ashrei in Hebrew is different than the word baruch, blessed. Ashrei is not a reward that God gives to those who do the right thing. Ashrei is a natural state of happiness that arises from having made good choices. And that's what this psalm is describing. It's describing the natural, joyful state of those who are grounded in God's word. They are not spending their time in this progressive association with those who are looking for trouble, with the wicked, the sinners, the scoffers. Instead, verse 2 says, "Yahweh's Torah is this one's delight, murmuring his instruction day and night." Now, in your English translations, you don't see the word Torah. Probably your translation says law or maybe instruction. The law of the Lord is this one's delight, or is his delight, but it is the word Torah. And so this psalm is looking back at the Torah and saying, if you want to be grounded, this is where to camp out. Camp out in the Torah, camp out in God's instructions, and make them a regular part of your diet. The portrait tells us about someone who is not just meditating in the sense of like mentally thinking about God's instructions, but who's actually verbally muttering or murmuring them. The Hebrew word is hagah, and it's a verbal blah, 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 blah that happens as you're walking along. This person who's rooted and grounded in the Torah is constantly mulling over and muttering their way through God's commands and his instructions. And that word comes up again in Psalm 2, verse 1, to describe the kings of the nations who are murmuring or muttering insurrection against Yahweh's anointed. And it tells us there that those who are opposed to Yahweh and his rule will be put in their place by the Messiah. So it's interesting, the links, there's actually multiple links between Psalm 1 and 2 that make them like an entryway into the rest of the book of Psalms. One of those links is the word ashrei that we talked about, happy or blessed or joyful is the one. Psalm 2 ends with the word ashrei. So the word gives us like bookends for those first two psalms. And this is another of the links, hagah. So in Psalm 1 we have the righteous one who's muttering the Torah, and in Psalm 2 we have the wicked who are muttering insurrection against Yahweh. Verse 3 tells us more about this righteous one, this rooted one. They are like a tree transplanted by water canals, which produces its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither, and everything this one does prospers. I love this image of transplanting, and I'd never seen that before I was digging into the Hebrew. The word shatul could be planted or transplanted, but I think it's especially interesting to think of this as transplanting because by the time the Israelites are reading and reciting this psalm, they're likely in exile in Babylon. They've been ripped out of their own homeland and brought to a foreign land and forced to live there. So they've been transplanted against their will. And yet the psalm talks about a tree that's transplanted and thrives. And the reason this tree can thrive is because it's transplanted by water canals. So even in this new environment in exile, this person is able to thrive because they have placed themselves beside life-giving instruction. They're continuing to meditate on, to murmur through the Torah, even though they're far from home. So if 2020 has been a disruptive year for you, if you feel out of sorts or out of routine and you feel like you need to be centered again, you need to be grounded or rooted, I encourage you to spend some time with Psalm 1 and spend time on this portrait of what does it look like to be rooted. Next week we'll talk about the other portrait that's presented in Psalm 1, the portrait of the wicked, and we'll compare those two. But for now, I hope you have a great week.